As the government continues to hear concerns from parents, educators, and religious groups, the province nevertheless intends to introduce the new sex ed curriculum by September 2015. Joining us now for their perspectives on the changes in the nation's capital via Skype, Peter John Mitchell, senior researcher at the Institute for Marriage and Family Canada. And with us here in studio, Kim Martin, sexual health educator with Toronto Public Health, Burqa Gupta, coordinator of teen programming and social media at Planned Parenthood Toronto, and Rachel Giza, author of the article The Talk in the April 2014 edition of the Walrus Magazine. And it's good to have, Peter John, you there in Ottawa for us, and you three here in our studio. Let me ask everybody just to get comfortable for a second here, because I'm going to read some stuff that's going to sort of set the table for the discussion to come. Sheldon, if you would, this graphic. In December, the Ontario Physical and Health Education Association, OPHEA, ran newspaper ads in a bunch of cities stating the following. Over 2 million students in Ontario's publicly funded schools are being taught from a health and physical education curriculum that is over 15 years old. Sensationalism about the sex ed component of this curriculum is stalling the government's decision to release the revised elementary and secondary H&PE curriculum. And the ad also included these statements. Fiction. Sex ed results in kids having sex earlier. Fact. Sexual health education does not increase the frequency of sexual behavior or the number of sexual partners and may result in delayed sexual activity. Fiction. Parents don't want the revised H&PE curriculum or even sex ed in schools. Fact. Almost all Ontario parents, 93%, are calling for an updated sexual health component. Education is most effective when parents or guardians, schools, and community share responsibility in supporting students' learning. That's the OPHEA ad, which, as I suggested, was published in numerous newspapers around the province last year. Let's just start with this. Peter John, do you think it's time to update the sex ed curriculum in Ontario?
Yeah, the sex ed curriculum, as I think it's been well stated, is dating back from 1998, so that's a long time. And all curriculum, whether it's math curriculum, science, whatever, goes through a stage of being updated. So it certainly is time to update the curriculum. What continues in that curriculum is another matter.
Well, hold off on that. We'll get to what ought to be in it first, but I just want to clarify from everybody, first of all, whether you think it's time to update or are we okay? Kim, what do you say?
Long overdue.
Long overdue? Yeah. Burqa?
Long overdue.
Rachel?
Agreed, absolutely.
So we're all agreed it is time to update. Okay, let's follow up with this. Kim, I'll go to you in this. When the 2010 curriculum update was put forward by the then Dalton McGuinty Liberals, there was a lot of criticism at the time that a number of stakeholders, hate that word, but there you go, stakeholders were not consulted adequately, including parents. Tough to imagine parents would raise such a stink if they were trying to update the geography curriculum, right? Mm-hmm. There's something about sex ed. Do you think parents should feel entitled to a grand consultation on updating the sex ed curriculum?
I think it's wise for the ministry to consult parents on this. I think parents are the main sex educators for kids.
Is that right?
They are. I mean, particularly at a younger age. And I'm including what's not said as much as what's said. So the messages we get from our families are the things that really stick most strongly with us through a lot of our life. And this is not geography, because this is a curriculum that's based on the students, right? They are the subjects of this curriculum.
That makes it different from geography or math or whatever else.
Yeah, and so I do think for those reasons it is important to involve parents. How to do that, I think, is another question.
Okay, how to do that, Rachel? You got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, parents should be consulted. At the same time, I think that parents need to recognize that this is a very emotional subject for them, that they are going to have lots of feelings and emotions in reaction to their children learning about sex and sexuality that might be irrational responses. And I think that, I agree with Kim that parents are, very important in talking to their kids about sex. I don't think that parents should be the only people who teach kids about sex and sexuality, because I don't think that most parents have the tools to do it, have the comfort level to do it, and I'm not sure that every kid wants to learn everything from their parents in this area. I think that there are people who are better positioned, have better knowledge and better expertise to talk to kids about sex and sexuality and relationships.
Peter John, what's your view on whether parents are potentially not the best people to have the most impact here?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that we're talking, when we're talking about sex education throughout the life course, we're talking about a big spectrum between grade 1 and all the way through to high school, through high school. The data would show us that parents feel actually quite comfortable addressing this issue. There was a Legend Marketing poll a few years ago that suggested that that moms of teens were the #1 source that teen girls went to in terms of seeking advice about contraception. That 95% of moms felt comfortable having that conversation. In fact, 68% of them initiated that conversation. So definitely think that parents certainly have a role, and I think that because of that, and because I believe that they are the primary sex educators, they do need to be consulted in some manner. I think what happened in 2010 is that parents felt that they were caught off guard. They were put into a reactive situation, and I think that just heightens some of the anxiety around the curriculum.
Burka, how much parental consultation do you think is important?
I think when it comes to something like this, it's important to think about parents, right? Because parents will get involved. And I think in 2010, what happened is because parents weren't involved at all, it blew up in a different way. But like you're saying around geography and other subjects, I think we need to trust the experts in this. And I think we need to also remember that the experts are also parents, many of them, right? They've also have younger kids, and they also have kids that have already been teenagers. And so it's important to also trust the fact that we're all in this together and that we're doing something that makes sense for what's happening today. And then I agree with Rachel in what she said around that, like, parents aren't the only ones that I think will be able to do this, because when it comes to sex ed, parents aren't comfortable talking about all of this, and they don't know all of it, because we didn't learn about sex ed in school either.
Well, what about what Peter John just said, which is that most, particularly female parents of daughters, feel quite comfortable and in fact initiate that conversation?
Yes, and it's great that that's happening, but the conversation that's still happening, if we're talking about contraception, is all of the focus is on pregnancy or STI prevention. And what teens
STI prevention?
Sorry, STI prevention and pregnancy. It's sexually transmitted infections. Thank you.
Okay.
And what teens are facing today is much larger than that. It's not just about pregnancy and STI prevention. It's also about thinking about porn literacy and media literacy and healthy relationships.
We're going to get to that. Before we get there, though, trust the experts, Rachel. Trust the experts. Parents might be inclined, I don't know, I'm speculating here, they might be inclined to trust the experts on the best way to teach history or geography or math. But sex ed is different. Everybody knows it's different. Can we just leave it to the experts to teach our kids about sex ed?
No, and I didn't say that. I mean, I think that what I'm saying is, I think that you know, parents have a role. As Kim said, they are the people who have the biggest role in influencing attitudes and ideas about sexuality, about sexual health, about relationships. And I also think that just as an exercise, if someone were to go to their computer and Google porn and see what came up, I don't know that most parents would have the tools to talk to their 12-year-old who can also Google porn and see what comes up. I don't know that most parents are equipped to have those conversations with their kids. I think that I have an 11-year-old son. I grew up in a completely different time when it comes to the role of technology in relationships. I didn't deal with many of the things that my 11-year-old son is dealing with. So I want some experts to help me get through this stuff. I believe I have an important role in talking to my kid about sex and sexuality and relationships, and I think there's a lot of really smart, thoughtful people who also have a role in teaching my kid about sex and sexuality.
So Peter John, let's understand if you think the government this time has consulted better than it did 5 years ago when the issue kind of exploded in their face. They did an electronic survey this time. One parent from every school in the province of Ontario consulted. Is that good enough for you?
I'm looking at that survey. It's pretty vague and pretty generic on the questions. It also comes pretty late in the game. You're just going to need to be able to pick up this curriculum and start teaching it in the fall. I'm not sure how much maneuverability. We've been told there's some maneuverability to react to that, but looking at that particular document, that particular exercise, at least it's something. I would applaud government that it's made a step, but I just looking at the document, I'm not sure it's the kind of consultation late in the game that parents wanted. The other thing that I would say, just kind of going back to the other things that have been said, one of the challenges of creating a curriculum is that it's not very flexible. And so that it's really up to parents to determine the sensitivities of their child. And that may differ from child to child, even in a family. And so parents need to be able to navigate that, to understand how to communicate and when to communicate certain things to their kids. The American Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry suggests that you respond to the curiosity of your child, not too much, not too little, but that you're finding that right spot, and that's a challenge. And yes, one of the good things about the internet, I know we've talked about some of the bad things, but one of the good things is it's really open to finding resources that parents can tap into, all kinds of resources, helping having that.
I'm afraid to ask, Rachel, but since you raised it, I'm going to ask. Do you know what kind of internet surfing your 11-year-old is doing as it relates to pornography?
Yeah, I mean, we're really on top of it, right? I mean, I think this is something that we're really conscious of, and these are conversations that we do have with our son about what he puts in a text to a friend, about what he puts in an email, about what's online. We have these conversations. I think that we're fairly comfortable, and at the same time, we've also outsourced some of those conversations to friends and family members who our son trusts, who we think he might have an easier time about certain things, talking to other people about other than us. And he also is in the Toronto District School Board. He is getting sex ed in the school board. So, I mean, he's getting a lot of information from different sources, and I think that's a really healthy way to educate on this subject.
Why is it the case, Kim, that some students do better learning sex ed not at all from their parents, but from teachers, family friends, anybody but the parents? How come?
I think, as I mentioned, kids pick up a tone very early on. And it's often what's not said as much as what is said or how something is said. And I think if students pick that up at a very early age, that
give me an example. What's the what not said that you're referring to there?
Oh, well, if a child says, you know, why is Auntie's belly so big? You know, someone comes to visit, and one of the parents or caregivers says, oh, don't be rude and asking questions like that, right? So it's like a conversation shut down.
Shuts it down.
And so I think there are many occasions, and more subtle than that, when children are growing up, that they sense that this is not something that is okay to talk about or ask about in my household.
Gotcha.
You know?
Okay, we talked about AFIA earlier. We showed those two graphics from AFIA. They also produced a video calling for another voice to be included in considering what changes should be made to sex ed. Let's take a look at that. Roll tape.
Our voice will tell us
that there's different kinds of families.
Allow me to be more accepting
of what is different.
Our voice would help us protect ourselves.
It would help me to stand up to bullying.
It would help me to stand up to bullying.
Our voice would tell us that what is within me
is bigger than stigmas and stereotypes.
Our voice.
Our voice. Our voice.
Our voice.
Our voice
would help me to know when it's okay
and when it isn't.
If our curriculum was our voice,
it would challenge us to think.
Our voice will make us more resilient.
Would help us live a longer, healthier life. To build better relationships.
To be more skillful.
To be myself.
To be myself. To be myself.
To be myself.
What if that voice would help me feel better every day?
And what if that voice was taken away from us?
Burkett, what's going on there?
I think youth are speaking for themselves. At Planned Parenthood Toronto, we always talk about letting youth talk about what they need, and they come to us and tell us that all the time. While it's important to bring parents to the conversation, it's also important to hear from youth of what they're missing from their parents, from their curriculum, and what they're getting online and from peers. And some of those answers are what's in the new curriculum or what we're talking about and proposing, right?
What do you hear from them that is currently missing?
What we hear from them is a lot of conversations about bodies. They want to know about puberty, and we get a lot of questions about body in terms of size, what changes to expect, am I normal? And we answer those all the time, and a lot of it is around the fear and the normalization that doesn't happen around sexual health and bodies. We also hear a lot of questions about masturbation.
What age?
As young as 10, 11. Going into like late teens, they change the nature of the question.
10 and 11-year-olds even know that word?
Yes.
They do.
Absolutely, and I think Kim can also attest to that. because we're in the age of internet, right? Where we have Urban Dictionary, we have Google, we have YouTube, and porn now isn't a credit card. It's actually just am I 18? Yes, and you move on, right? So really young kids know what masturbation is, or they know when they touch their bodies, things might feel good, but they don't know what that is, and then they feel guilty or they're worried about what that means.
Kim, follow up on that, because you're in the classrooms a lot. What are you hearing from young people today that isn't in the sex ed curriculum currently?
Well, again, some of the physical changes and so forth, but also there's a lack of inclusivity in the present. Well, it almost is non-existent in terms of children who are gender variant and just anything that's outside what is sort of seen as the norm.
Quote unquote normal.
It doesn't exist. And then really communications and relationships. And we were just saying, we think the curriculum should be busted up and biology should just be taught under biology, and then there should be, communications, relationships, and all that taught separately, because that's really the heart and soul of it. That's, in terms of who we are as sexual people, we can, especially, well, any age now, you can go and find out details about physical stuff, but it's the skills and it's those conversations that need to happen.
Peter John, what are you hearing young people say about the role that their parents play in their own sex education?
When young people speak to researchers, at least, they do say that in terms of making decisions about sexual behavior, that parents do have an influence in that. In fact, the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy in the U.S., it's a nonprofit in the U.S., it suggests, surveys students and parents consistently, and says that parents are the number one influence in that decision. Not the only influence, but it tends to be the number one influence. Some of that data also suggests that kids wish their parents would actually be a little more vocal about it, and not, again, at different ages, but would have more to say about sexual health and some of that. Some of those, obviously, I think we've acknowledged as children get older, there's some more voices in that as well, but I think the parents tend to be still have a role. I think it's important to realize too that sexual health information is important, but also some of those values are formed, I think, as Kim said, in the home early on. And some of the studies that we've done at the Institute of Marriage and Family Canada, looking at longitudinal data, looking at the child household and home environment, and looking at teen sexual decision making later on. It's an important connection there, and making sure that parents keep the lines of communication open and develop relationships where kids can feel safe at home to talk about things. And yeah, especially if there's a crisis, that those lines of communication are open and home is a safe place.
I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up that shot again that you just had. Can you bring that up, Sheldon? All four of our guests at once, because I want to ask them, does anybody here feel that the school system ought not to be providing any sex ed at all? Anybody? I'm seeing head shaking on the bottom. No, even, Peter John, even you believe there is a role for the schools in educating young people about sex ed?
I would say it's a secondary role, but there's a role there.
Make the distinction. Help me understand the distinction. You say a secondary as opposed to a primary role.
Well, I think parents that are primary educators, and they're the ones that are closest to their kids and understand the sensitivities, understand the complexities of their own children. I think, and in fact, in New Brunswick, New Brunswick went through a similar process of updating curriculum in the 2000s, and some of the research coming out of there said if you want to have a healthy, effective curriculum, you got to engage parents as partners.
Sure, that goes for everything, though.
I think that goes for everything, but I'm not sure that's what I hear when I hear advocation for the new curriculum. Sometimes I feel like it's parents are squeamish, parents don't have what it takes, so we need to have this curriculum. I would rather see a more partner type approach taken. And I'm sometimes worried in the way that the promotion has come across that it's parents might get the thought that they don't have what it takes. And I think it is true that parents do underestimate their influence oftentimes.
Well, let me follow up with this. I think, Burke, I think this is out of your Toronto Teen Survey report. That's yours, isn't it? Yep. Okay, Sheldon, let's put this up and we'll read this. While almost 92% of youth surveyed have received some form of sexual health education, 8% have had none at all. Both young women and men are most likely to seek information from friends but both would prefer to get it from professional sources, doctors, nurses, teachers, etc. Conspicuous by their absence on that list are parents. Where do you see parents on that equation?
So parents still play a really important role, right? And I think what Kim was alluding to, which is about the nonverbal things that happen in houses, is where the conversation really starts, right? Is when we talk about sexual health education, so much of it is about normalizing sexual health. And that means intimacy, that means consent, that means talking about bodies and knowing that everything that's happening to us is natural. And that starts with the parents. It never starts in school. It doesn't start with sexual health educators or professionals. It starts in homes. But what happens there is if parents at a really young age feel like they're not ready for their kids to learn about things, or if they're like, you don't need to know that, or that's too late, very early on they get messages that this is not what I can talk to my parents about. And then even if it's something more important or larger that they want to talk to their parents about, they're worried that they're worried, they're afraid, they're worried that they're going to get in trouble. And so either they go to other sources, which is often friends, because the school system isn't giving them those sources, or they hopefully find a source like ours. And so that's, I think, where that comes from, is that they go to their peers first and then they go to professionals because they trust that more.
I think it's also really important to make the distinction. Parents have an intention of speaking, because I talk to so many parents, especially of younger children, and almost everyone knows that this is an important thing to have included in their family life.
That they should be discussing.
That they should be. How many people actually do that, and do that in a positive, consistent way, just as we do about food, you know? Like, nobody should remember the first conversation they had about food in their life, right? And that should be the same with sexuality. Nobody should grow up remembering, oh yeah, there was that discussion or that talk. It should be something that's incremental and consistently throughout.
And natural, I presume.
Yeah.
Rachel, let me ask about religion. Where is the church, the mosque, the synagogue in all of these conversations?
Well, I think in a public school system, that becomes a very tricky question, doesn't it? Because, you know, our secular school system is just that. I think students come to school.
That's half right.
Yeah, I mean, but I think our students come to school with their entire background, right? They come with the values they get at home. They come with the good values. They come with the biases, perhaps. They come as an entire package. I mean, I think the framing of this is interesting, because I think it's a point that Peter John had made about it often seems like there's this, like, I feel like there's sometimes this search for, like, what is the agenda and what the school is trying to do to our kids. And I actually think that I think the school is just trying to give good information to kids. And I think that the thing that all of us agree on here on this panel, even if we don't agree about certain things, is that there is a communal role in educating children about sexuality, about healthy relationships, about sex and sexuality. And I think that there's a much more complicated conversation about how we negotiate someone's religious beliefs in a secular school system when it comes to talking about things like gay or lesbian relationships, for instance.
But you keep saying a secular school system, and that's really, I mean, we have secular and we have a Catholic school system as well. How much daylight is there between the way sex ed is taught in those two systems?
That, I mean, I can't speak to that. I mean, I feel like Kim might have a better take.
The curriculum is for all school boards throughout Ontario.
English, French, public, Catholic.
Exactly. And so everyone, in terms of the expectations, that is expected.
Everyone's expected to buy in.
Exactly. How they do that, each school board and each school and each teacher does that differently, you know. But the expectation is the same, and I do think, as the minister talked about in her segment, you know, there are add-ons that different groups will do to the basic curriculum.
Be particular to their situation. Let me bring to everybody's attention, here's the Walrus Magazine. You ever seen this before, Rachel?
I have.
I think you have. You wrote a piece for the Walrus last April. You look specifically at sex ed for grade 9 boys, and I wonder why that cohort was of particular interest to you.
Well, the cohort was interesting, but largely it was the program that was interesting. It's a program out of Calgary called Wise Guys, and it was established at the Calgary Sexual Health Center, which is sort of similar to Planned Parenthood or the Toronto Public Health, so it's separate from the school system. And they looked around, they'd been in existence for 30 years. They looked around and realized they didn't have any programming for young straight men. So they had a ton of programming, a ton of education for young straight women, for gay guys, but that this was a group that they had overlooked when it came to sexual health and sexual health education. So they created a very thoughtful program for boys and then shopped that program to the school system in Calgary.
This is Wise Guys.
This is Wise Guys.
G-U-Y-Z.
Z, yes.
Because it has to be spelled cool,
It has to be spelled cool. Yeah. It's grade 9 boys. And it is a really thoughtful, comprehensive program that is not mandatory, it's voluntary, so schools can opt into providing it, and then the boys themselves can opt into taking the program. It runs for pretty much the course of the entire year, once a week.
Did you like it?
It's an amazing program. It's thoughtful. It puts sex and sexuality in the context of relationships, of positive self-esteem. It talks about issues like consent, like bullying, friendships, communication, negotiation.
Who teaches it?
So it's taught right now by 3 sexual health educators, guys who are all late 20s, early 30s.
All men?
All men. And it's taught just to boys.
And that's, I presume, important, that it's men teaching boys.
It was, when they were researching how to reach this particular age group, and I think that Kim and Burka can speak to sort of the benefits and some of the challenges of working in co-ed groups. But for this particular age group and this particular curriculum, they felt it was important just to talk to boys. And it's an incredibly thoughtful program. And what's interesting is, you know, the actual plumbing, the actual sort of sex biology, you know, this goes here, this goes there, is not that big a component. The larger component is how to have a positive, healthy relationship, how to negotiate with your partner, how to negotiate with your friends.
Respectfully.
It's about emotional literacy. So all the challenges that we're talking about right now in terms of consent, in terms of sexual violence, in terms of rape on university campuses, this is a program that is trying to address those things before those behaviors actually occur.
Burka, I'm interested in your view on separating the genders at this stage of the student's life. What you think of that idea?
At grade 9?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that there's benefits and downfalls of sex segregation, right? And so sex segregation is really useful when we're talking about larger concepts of things like masculinity and femininity and how to think about behaviors and all of these things that media is teaching kids right now, which doesn't get talked about a lot. But the one thing that's key there, which is I think really prevalent in Wise Guys, is you need really strong facilitation. And you need really strong facilitators who know what they're talking about and will know how to handle the subject and be able to like facilitate it. And then also making sure that the schools are equipped and like individual educators are equipped to know how are they going to make sure that gender independent kids or trans kids are going to be seeing themselves in this sex segregation piece, right? So it's also important to know that like everyone's not going to fit into those boxes and the binaries, and it can create further alienation for kids. And so how are you going to handle that is really important. And then when it comes to the actual biology pieces or the pieces around relationships and dating and consent, I think there's also really a large benefit in not being sex segregated, because otherwise it also creates this concept of like the boys need to learn this, the girls need to learn this, we need to tell boys to behave, and we need to tell girls to protect ourselves.
But I think even more problematic is the us and them. Right?
Yes.
Is that when we're taught like that, when everything else is taught together, and then we sit, and I think for that program and for certain pieces of the program, it's very important to have, you know, same-sex groupings. But I think if that's the norm, then it becomes us and them. And we always treat them different than we treat us. And that's what we're trying to break down. You know, and I think just to your point when you talk about, you know, information being the main thing that comes in the curriculum, I think this new curriculum, and certainly in Toronto District School Board, really that sort of information piece is there, but there's a huge component that has to do with helping people identify feelings with consent issues and negotiation and relationships. So
let me read an excerpt from Rachel's piece that was in the Walrus Magazine. It was called The Talk. While noting that young people have far greater exposure and access to porn than ever before, and that it has been linked to unrealistic attitudes about sex and regressive views about gender, researchers had difficulty establishing a direct causal relationship. What may be more important than measuring the impact of pornography is addressing why adolescents look at so much of it. Researchers report, quote, emerging evidence that young people are dissatisfied with the sex education they're receiving and that they are increasingly drawing on pornography, expecting it to educate and give information regarding sexual practices and norms. How horrifying is that?
Well, it's challenging, and one of the things that's interesting about the Wise Guys program is it's not a judgmental program. So they don't say to the boys, porn is good or bad, or, you know, they say, okay, they suspect, most boys will say at the age of 14 they have looked at some kind of pornography. The facilitators say, well, you know, what did you think about it? What kind of messages were there? How were women portrayed? How were men portrayed? What questions you have about it? So I think Berko talked earlier about literacy around pornography. We are in an ever increasingly sexualized culture when it comes to our popular culture, not just porn, but I think, everything. So, you know, our kids are getting this message, they're getting this imagery, and they really need thoughtful people who can talk to them about what those messages are, to take them apart a little bit. A lot of the boys in the program were more confused than anything about it. They were like, is that what I'm supposed to do? Is that what girls like? Is that what my body is? Is that what a girl's body looks like? So and again, I don't know that's a conversation that a lot of 14-year-old boys want to have with their mom or dad. Right. I think to have a thoughtful, smart, 30-year-old trained sex educator have those conversations is really, really helpful. So
let me get Peter John on that. How concerned would you be that young people are actually picking up their sexual education from watching porn on the net?
Yeah, I'm sure that that's happening just because porn is so available. I think a lot of kids look at porn because it's stimulating, right? And we know more and more about the teen brain and how it works. And there's an article in Maclean's just recently just talking about some of the research that we know about teens' challenges in terms of weighing risk and that kind of factor. I think that parents need to be on this issue. They need to be on this issue even if they find it uncomfortable. It's not just the information, that's part of it too, but I think particularly for younger kids, some of the stuff that's online can be quite traumatizing for kids, and I think parents need to create sort of an atmosphere where kids will feel comfortable to come to them on that. I think we're learning more about the effects of porn. I think as I talked to other researchers, we're learning that there's physiological impact to heavy porn use. There's maybe even neurological impacts as well. We also know that a great deal of porn is actually connected to human trafficking as well, and so I think this is a social justice issue as well. So I'm maybe a little more reticent to put a value on it, to say there's a lot of it that is unhealthy, maybe than the other bets, but I think it's parents need to educate themselves on this as well. It's really important.
Kim, one of the things that Minister Sandals told us, the education minister off the top of the program, is that the lack of anything dealing with sexting and internet porn and bullying and that kind of thing in the current sex ed curriculum is why they're doing the update. So how do educators today deal with all of those issues when it's really absent or silent in the current curriculum?
Well, again, teachers are professionals, and they use other sources. So they go to the Alberta curriculum or the Planned Parenthood resources.
Are they allowed to do that?
Absolutely. Teachers, for teaching anything, they can find resources that, that help them meet the expectations. That's what they have to do. So teachers are doing a lot of this. It is also spoken about in some of the anti-bullying programs and so forth, certainly in the City of Toronto, that are happening. And also, in the Safe Schools Act now, teachers have to be trained, principals have to be on this. So we're not just looking at the sex ed and health curriculum to address this.
Okay, just a few minutes to go here, and I do want to put one last thing on the table, and that is Liz Sandals, again, the education minister, told us earlier in the program that the new curriculum will have more focus on abstinence as an option. What do you think of that?
What do I think of that? You said there's a few minutes left. I think if that's what parents want, and I think that that's what the school system is, telling people that abstinence is an option is a very viable option. But we also can't negate the fact that youth are having sex, teens are having sex. This is not new information. Studies show that sexual activity hasn't really changed over the years and decades. Kids are having different kinds of sex now, and so if it's not talked about, that's problematic, like anal sex or oral sex. But I think it needs to be a balanced approach, that as long as we are talking about abstinence, we need to also know that youth will still want to have sex or will be having sex. And so that we need to make sure that they know what they need. The other thing I always talk about quickly is that we're supposed to teach youth everything they need to know from a basic standpoint in school. People don't wake up at 25 and go, now I'm ready for sex because I'm married, and now I need to know what sex is. If we're supposed to be teaching youth about sex or being ready for health in general and healthy lives, why is sex ed the one that's always forgotten?
Rachel, is the notion of teaching abstinence to young people spitting into the wind?
No, not necessarily. But again, one of the things I was thinking about as we were talking is I do feel that there can be in a lot of sex ed curriculum this idea that it's like this grim, joyless affair, and here are all the pitfalls and all the diseases and all the consequences. It's very negative. And I think that there is a way in talking about what's appropriate for you, what the right time is for you, that also acknowledges that sex is a natural, joyful part of the human experience, and to not make our sex education this sort of, grim, terrifying thing for kids. But I think within the context of talking about it being a normal, healthy, positive thing, you can also talk to a kid, as we saw in that PSA, that what's right for you, what do you want, not what's right, but what's right for you, for your body, for your time, for your life cycle. And I think those are the kinds of really healthy, positive conversations we can have.
We have more time on this program than I think any other one on television to discuss things, and it's still never enough.
No.
But we did pretty well today, I think. Peter John Mitchell, it's good of you to join us from the nation's capital, from the Institute for Marriage and Family Canada. Here in our studio, Kim Martin from Toronto Public Health, Burka Gupta, Planned Parenthood Toronto, Rachel Giza, whose work I'm sure you can see online on the Walrus's website. She did the piece back in April called The Talk. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.